What happens when a kingdom's greatest treasure isn't stolen, but escapes of its own free will? Across all of Eldoria, the royal decree echoed through every square and was nailed to every tavern wall. 100,000 gold coins for the safe return of Princess Elara. The kingdom was in panic, believing their beloved heir had been kidnapped by monsters or an enemy nation. They imagined her in a cold dungeon, crying for rescue. The truth, however, was infinitely more dangerous. The princess was not in a dungeon. She was aboard the Serpent's Kiss, the most infamous ship on the seven seas, and the last thing she wanted in the world was to be found. King Theron of Eldoria saw his kingdom through fear, a fear that led him to promise the hand of his only daughter, Elara, to Duke Alastair. To the king, it was an alliance of power, a way to strengthen their borders against the rising threat of corsairs. To Elara, it was the final sentence of her life as a golden bird in a gilded cage. Alastair was a man whose cruelty was as well known as his wealth. His smile never reached his eyes, and his hands, always adorned with expensive rings, looked better suited for strangling than for caressing. On the night before the engagement ceremony, Elara stared at the sea from her tower window. The ocean did not promise safety nor comfort. It promised something far more valuable. A choice. And that choice was the only thing that mattered. With the help of a single loyal maid, Elara traded her silk gowns for servant rags and the weight of her crown for a small bundle of bread and cheese. She climbed down a wall of ivy, feeling the thorns scratch her soft hands, each scratch a baptism into her new life. She didn't run east toward allied noble lands. She ran west to the stink of fish and rum in Saltwind, the dirtiest, most lawless port city in the kingdom. A place where the life of a princess was worth nothing, and the life of a nameless girl called Leah might, with luck, be ignored. For 2 months, she survived. She washed dishes in a tavern called the Sunken Anchor, slept on a flea-infested cot, and learned to distinguish the sound of a bar fight from the sound of a murder. Fear was a constant companion, but it was her fear, a wild, free fear, so different from the suffocating, perfumed fear of the castle. It was on a stormy night that fate, or hell, found her. The harbor bell rang, not as a warning, but as a scream of panic. The torches outside the tavern danced wildly, casting giant shadows on the walls. The door burst open like a battering ram, and the sound that entered wasn't rain. It was chaos. Pirates. But not just any pirates. The flag, briefly illuminated by lightning, bore a silver serpent devouring a golden crown. The flag of Captain Kane, the Ironheart. A man who, according to legend, had not been born of a woman, but forged in the heart of a volcano. They said he navigated not by the stars, but by the trail of tears left by his victims. His name was a whisper used to frighten children and nobles alike. He didn't raid for gold or jewels. He struck with surgical precision, breaking fleets and supply lines for reasons no one fully understood. And now, his crew was turning the Sunken Anchor upside down. Elara, or rather Leah, hid in the pantry, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. She heard the screams, the clash of steel, the sound of men begging for their lives. She closed her eyes, praying to gods she no longer believed in. The pantry door shattered, and there he stood, framed by the chaotic light of the tavern. Kane was not the grotesque monster of stories. He was worse. Tall, with the posture of someone who had never known doubt. Thin scars like spiderwebs crossed his face, not disfiguring him, but telling a story no one dared ask about. But it was his eyes that froze Elara. Storm gray, empty of emotion. They assessed her not as a woman, but as an object, an item on an inventory list. He said nothing, just gestured to his men. Elara found herself dragged outside, her feet barely touching the rain-soaked, blood-stained ground. She expected death, or worse. But on the docks, among other trembling captives, Kane finally spoke. His voice was calm, yet powerful enough to cut through the storm. "We need a cook. Ours got scurvy." One of his men pointed at Elara. "This one worked in the kitchen, Captain." Kane looked at her again, a long, measuring look. A breeze would break her. Elara, moved by a surge of defiance she didn't know she possessed, lifted her chin and said, her voice trembling but clear, "I can cook, and I don't break easily." Silence fell, broken only by the howl of the wind. The corner of Kane's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she imagined he could ever manage. A humorless, sharp twist. "Take her." As she was pushed toward the ship, Elara caught one last glimpse of the city. On a post, her wanted poster, soaked by the rain, promised a fortune for her return. The face of the lost princess. And there she was, being carried into the depths of the ocean by the one man her father hated more than the idea of losing his daughter. The kingdom's greatest enemy was now her captor. And in that moment, Elara didn't know it yet, but escaping Duke Alistair had thrown her into a far older, far deadlier game. A game Captain Kane had spent his entire life preparing to win. Aboard the Serpent's Kiss, the smell of wet wood, tar, and despair wrapped around her. She was thrown into the ship's kitchen, a dark, swaying hole. Her new life had begun. She was no longer Princess Elara, hunted by her people. She was no longer Leah, the anonymous servant. She was the cook of the Ironheart, a possession, a nobody. At least that's what she believed, and that was exactly what Captain Kane needed her to be. Because the secret he carried in his iron heart was as heavy and dangerous as the crown she had left behind. For days, Elara only cooked. She witnessed the brutality of pirate life, the iron discipline Kane imposed. He was a ghost on his own ship, always watching, always silent. He never spoke to her again, until one night, a drunk pirate, bigger than a bear, cornered her in the kitchen, his rum-soaked breath on her face. When his hand grabbed her arm, Elara did not scream. She braced for pain. But pain never came. A shadow moved faster than a blink. Kane was there. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply grabbed the pirate's wrist and squeezed. The crack of breaking bones was sharp and sickening. The man collapsed, whimpering. Kane looked down at him, his voice cold as steel. "She is the ship's cook, not your entertainment. Touch her again, and you'll feed the sharks." Then he turned to Elara. His storm-gray eyes held no anger, no pity. They held something she couldn't decipher. A command. Get back to work. He vanished into the shadows of the deck. Elara stood there, her arm aching where the pirate had grabbed her, her heart a storm of terror and something else. She had expected a lawless monster. Instead, she found something far more complex. A man,
with a code. And in that instant, the princess realized the greatest danger wasn't being Captain Kane's prisoner. It was beginning to understand him.
On the Serpent's Kiss, fear was a currency, and Captain Kane had minted it himself. After he shattered a man's wrist for touching her, Elaran's status changed. She was no longer just a captive. She was a piece of the ship, untouchable, like the captain's compass or his cutlass. The crew, a collection of the hardest men Elara had ever seen, now gave her a wide berth. They would meet her gaze with a flicker of respect, or perhaps just primal fear of their captain's wrath. For Elara, this protection was another kind of cage. She was safe from the crew, but she was more aware than ever that her life belonged entirely to the silent, gray-eyed man who ruled this floating kingdom of wood and rope. Weeks bled into a month. The endless blue of the ocean became Elara's world. The creak of the ship, her only lullaby. Her hands, once soft from a life of leisure, became calloused and capable. She learned the rhythm of the ship, the pre-dawn rush to bake hardtack, the midday meal of salted fish and grog, the quiet simmer of a stew for the night watch. In the galley, her small kingdom of pots and barrels, she found a strange sense of peace. But she was a princess, trained to observe, to understand the currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of conversation. And she watched Captain Kane. He was a man of iron routine. He rose before the sun and was the last to sleep. He moved with a purpose that seemed to consume him, his eyes always on the horizon, as if searching for something lost long ago. He never laughed. He rarely spoke a word that wasn't in order. The crew feared him, but they also followed him with a loyalty that bordered on religious. She saw him personally inspect every rope, every sail, as if the ship were an extension of his own body. She saw him divide plunder with a fairness that stunned her, ensuring even the lowest cabin boy received a proper share. He was a brute, a killer, a pirate, but he was not a chaotic monster. He was a man governed by a code she could not decipher. One night, unable to sleep, she crept onto the main deck. The moon was a silver coin in a velvet sky, and the sea was calm. She saw him standing alone at the stern, not looking out at the water, but down at something in his hands. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse on this ship, pulled her into the shadows. She saw him open a small, battered locket. He did not look at it with sadness or with love. He looked at it with a cold, pure focus, the way a predator watches its prey. The look in his eyes was not of a man remembering a lost love, but of a man renewing a vow of vengeance. He closed it with a sharp snap, and the sound seemed to break the stillness of the night. He had not noticed her. Elara slipped back to her cot, her heart pounding. The Ironheart captain had a heart after all, but it seemed to be forged, not from love, but from a deep and ancient hatred. The turning point came during a squall that hit them without warning. A rogue wave crashed over the deck, sending men and crates sliding. A young sailor named Pip was thrown against the main mast, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. His scream of agony was ripped away by the wind. They dragged him below deck, his face pale with shock. The ship's so-called surgeon, a burly man with scars for knuckles, produced a rusty saw and a bottle of rum. "It'll have to come off," he grunted. Elara pushed through the crowd. "No! You'll kill him with infection," she said, her voice clear and commanding, a tone she hadn't used since she was a princess. All eyes turned to her. The surgeon sneered. "And what does a cook know?" Before she could answer, Kane's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. "Let her speak." He had appeared as if from the shadows, his gray eyes fixed on her. "At the castle," she began, catching her mistake instantly. She corrected herself. In the town where I worked, I assisted the physician. His leg is broken badly, but the bone may be set. Amputation is a death sentence out here." Kane stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was weighing her words, weighing her, the life of a cabin boy, against the word of a tavern wench. After a silence that felt like an eternity, he gave a curt nod. "Do it." The surgeon threw his hands up in disgust, but backed away. With Kane's silent authority behind her, Elara took command. She ordered water boiled, linens torn into clean strips, and rum for the boy to drink, not for the surgeon's saw. Her forgotten lessons came flooding back. With firm, practiced hands, she cleaned the wound and, with a sickening crunch that made the sailors wince, set the bone. She stitched the gash with a fishing needle and thread she had sterilized in a flame. Throughout the ordeal, Kane stood in the doorway, watching her every move, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. When she was done, Pip was unconscious from the rum and the pain, but his leg was straight, splinted with 2 pieces of wood. She was covered in sweat and grime, exhausted but alive with purpose. She stood up and finally met Kane's gaze. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gray eyes. Not gratitude. It was suspicion. Later that evening, he found her cleaning her supplies in the galley. The storm had passed, and the ship rocked gently. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching her. Then his voice came, low and devoid of emotion. "Where does a tavern cook learn to set a bone and stitch a wound like a royal physician?" Ilara's blood ran cold. This was it, the question she had dreaded for months. Her mind raced for a lie, an excuse, anything. But before she could answer, a shout came from the crow's nest. "Ship spotted! Starboard bow!" Kane was gone in an instant, his duty erasing their conversation. Elara followed him to the deck. The crew was already in motion, a hive of deadly activity. Kane raised a spyglass to his eye. He held it there, perfectly still, for a full minute. When he lowered it, his face was terrifying. The cold, controlled mask was gone, replaced by a look of such profound, predatory hatred that Elara took an involuntary step back. "What is it, Captain?" his first mate asked. "A merchant ship?" Kane's voice was a low growl, a sound that promised death. "No," he said, his eyes still fixed on the distant ship. "It's the Duke Alistair's personal flagship." He then turned and gave the order that would seal all their fates. "Raise the colors, no quarter. We are not taking that ship. We are erasing it from the sea." Elara stared in horror. The man she had run from, the reason for her exile, was here. And the man who had saved her, the man she was beginning to see as something more than a monster, was about to launch a suicidal attack against him. Her past and her present were on a collision course, and she was trapped squarely in the middle of a war she had unknowingly started.
There is no sound quite like the one a pirate ship makes when it prepares for battle. It's the groan of the rigging being pulled taut, the thunder of 100 bare feet on deck, the sharp, metallic song of cutlasses being drawn from their sheaths. For Elara, standing frozen on the deck of the Serpent's Kiss, it was the sound of her 2 worlds colliding. Ahead, the Duke Alistair's flagship, the Pride of Eldoria, was a floating fortress, its polished cannons gleaming, its royal banners snapping arrogantly in the wind. Her ship was smaller, faster, a predator circling its much larger prey. And at its helm stood Captain Kane, his face no longer a mask of cold control, but the visage of a vengeful god. He was not giving orders to win a battle, he was orchestrating a slaughter. "Take her below," Kane roared, not to Elara, but to his first mate, his eyes never leaving the enemy ship. Elara was shoved towards the hatch, descending into the belly of the ship as the first cannonballs ripped through the air above. The world dissolved into a symphony of chaos. The roar of their own cannons was a physical blow, shaking the very timbers of the ship. She could hear the splintering crash of wood, the screams of men, the deafening thunder of the fight for life and death happening just a few feet above her head. She was in the gun deck, a suffocating space filled with smoke, sweat, and the grim-faced men feeding the cannons. But she couldn't stay here. Her place was further down. She made her way to the makeshift infirmary where she had saved the boy Pip. It was already a scene of carnage. Wounded men were being carried down, their bodies broken and bleeding. The ship's surgeon was overwhelmed, his methods brutal and clumsy. Elara didn't hesitate. She tore strips of linen, barked orders for fresh water, and went to work. The princess who once shuddered at a paper cut was now pressing her hands against gaping wounds, her simple servant's dress quickly becoming stained with the blood of pirates. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, blocking out the sounds of the battle, focusing only on the man in front of her, then the next and the next. Her royal training in etiquette and diplomacy was useless here, but the lessons from the royal physician, the knowledge she had absorbed out of sheer boredom, had now become the most valuable treasure on the entire ship. This is the strange alchemy of fate. The skills we acquire for one life are often the very tools we need to survive the next. The true measure of a person isn't the title they are given, but the strength they find when everything is taken away. And if you enjoy stories about discovering that hidden power within, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because Elara was just beginning to discover hers. She worked tirelessly, her mind a fortress against the chaos, her hands becoming a blur of efficiency. She was no longer a princess in hiding. She was no longer a cook. In the heart of the battle, she had become a healer. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, then a new sound, a grinding, wrenching crash as the two ships collided. The grappling hooks had found their mark. The fighting was no longer at a distance, it was hand-to-hand on the deck. From below, Elara could hear the clash of steel, the desperate war cries, the terrible final sounds of men dying. Through it all, she could hear one voice, Kane's, not shouting, but delivering clear, concise, and deadly orders. She crept to the bottom of the ladder and looked up through the hatch. She saw him. He moved through the battle not like a man, but like a force of nature. His twin cutlasses were a whirlwind of silver death. He wasn't fighting with the frantic rage of a berserker, but with the cold, focused fury of an executioner. He was cutting a direct path towards the enemy captain's quarters, his eyes burning with a hatred so profound it was terrifying to behold. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. A silence fell, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of flames. The Duke's flagship was a ruin, its masts shattered, its deck a scene of utter devastation. The Serpent's Kiss had won. The victory was total, brutal, and absolute. Elara emerged onto the deck, blinking in the harsh light. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood. Kane stood alone near the enemy's helm, his back to her. He was not looking at the spoils or the prisoners. He was looking at the horizon as if expecting to see the Duke himself materialize from the waves. But Alistair was not on the ship. He had likely been on a royal escort vessel, safely observing the battle from a distance. Kane's first mate approached him. "Captain, the Duke wasn't aboard, but we found his personal safe in the captain's cabin. We opened it." Kane turned slowly. His face was streaked with soot and blood, and a fresh gash ran along his temple, but he seemed not to notice. And his voice was dangerously quiet. The first mate gestured for two of his men to come forward. They were carrying a heavy, iron-bound chest. They set it down. Kane knelt and looked inside. He reached in, past documents and bags of coin, and pulled out a single object. He held it in his palm so tight his knuckles turned white. He was silent for a full minute, simply staring at it. Then he stood up, turned, and his gray eyes, colder and stormier than the sea itself, found Elara across the deck. He walked towards her, his steps slow and determined, each one a hammer blow against the sudden silence after the battle. The crew parted before him like the sea before a storm. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He said nothing. He simply opened his hand. Lying in his palm, delicate and pristine amidst the grime and blood, was a miniature portrait on a porcelain oval. It was a perfect, exquisite likeness, painted by the finest artist in the kingdom. It was the official engagement portrait of Princess Elara of Eldoria. Her heart stopped. The air left her lungs. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The entire crew was watching. Kane raised his eyes from the portrait to her face, searching, connecting, understanding. And then he spoke, his voice low, a razor's edge in the quiet aftermath of the battle. "Explain this."
On the deck of a conquered ship, surrounded by the ghosts of battle, the world had shrunk to the space between them. The sounds of the crew, the crackle of distant flames, the groans of the wounded, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only the weight of his stare and the impossible object lying in his hand. The portrait was her face, her life, her prison, all captured in painted porcelain. Elara's mind was a whirlwind of terror, but her body stood perfectly still. The girl who had hidden in a storeroom months ago was gone. The woman who had set a man's bones and stitched his wounds in the middle of a cannonade stood in her place. She met his gaze. His gray eyes were not just angry, they were a vortex of betrayal, suspicion, and a chilling, possessive fury. The question he had asked, "Explain this," was not a request. It was a death sentence waiting for a final plea. The crew watched, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. They saw their untouchable cook and a princess's face, and they could not reconcile the two. Kane's jaw was a line of granite. He closed his hand, the delicate portrait disappearing within his calloused fist. "In my cabin, now." He didn't shout. The quiet command was infinitely more terrifying. He turned without waiting for a reply, and she knew she had no choice but to follow. He strode through the carnage, the crew parting before him, and Elara walked in his wake, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her back. Every step felt like walking towards the gallows. The captain's cabin was a stark reflection of the man himself. It was brutally neat, dominated by a large table covered in nautical charts. There were no decorations, no comforts, save for a single leather-bound book on a small shelf. He slammed the door behind them, and the latch clicking shut sounded like a cell door locking for the final time. He didn't look at her. He paced the small space, a caged lion, his coiled energy making the very air seem to vibrate. Finally, he stopped, placing both hands on the chart table, his back still to her. "Start talking." Elara took a breath, her voice steadier than she expected. "My name is Elara." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles in his back. It was the first time she had ever seen him react with anything other than cold control. I was, the crown princess of Eldoria." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was lethal. A spy. Was it all a game? Getting captured? Playing the helpless servant? "Did Alistair send you?" "No!" The word burst from her, sharp and desperate. "I ran from him. I ran from my father, from a life that was not my own. They were forcing me to marry the Duke." The name Alistair hung in the air between them. Kane's expression didn't soften. It hardened into something unreadable. A convenient story. A princess doesn't throw away a kingdom to wash dishes in a filthy port tavern. Why should I believe you? This was the moment. Her life depended on it. She looked him straight in the eye, channeling all the fear and fury of her escape into her words. "Because I saw in his eyes the same thing I see in yours right now. The belief that you can own a person, that you can control their fate. The king wanted an alliance. The duke wanted a trophy. Neither of them cared what I wanted. I would rather die on this ship as your cook than live as his duchess on a throne." She took a step closer, her own anger surprising her. "I did not run from a crown. I ran from the man you just tried to kill. The same man you clearly have your own reasons for hating." Her words hit their mark. The accusation hung in the air, turning his interrogation back on him. The mention of his own hatred for Alistair was a dagger she had unknowingly thrown, and it struck true. He stared at her, the storm in his eyes raging. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a cook, not as a princess, but as a woman with her own war. He was a man who understood the power of a singular, all-consuming purpose. He could see it in her. He could see the truth. But the truth didn't make things simpler. It made them infinitely more complex. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the gentle creaking of the ship. He walked over to a small wooden chest, unlocked it, and placed the miniature portrait inside, alongside the locket he had seen him with on the deck that night. He closed the lid, the click echoing the finality of a chapter ending. When he turned back to her, the murderous rage was gone, replaced by something far colder and more calculating. "You are a liability," he stated, the words flat and absolute. "Your face is on posters in every port. The king's entire navy is looking for you. If they find you here, on my ship,
They will have every excuse they need to hunt you to the ends of the earth." Elara's heart sunk. She had given him the truth, and he had translated it into a tactical problem. "So what now?" she whispered. "Will you kill me, or turn me in for the reward?" Kane walked to the table and unrolled a new chart, his movements precise, deliberate. "Killing you would be a waste, and I have no interest in the king's gold." He looked up, his gray eyes pinning her in place. "The Duke believes you were kidnapped. He will use your disappearance as an excuse to consolidate power, to move his fleets, to hunt his enemies, under the guise of rescuing you. Your escape has set a new game in motion, Princess." He let the title hang in the air, a deliberate reminder of who she was. "You are no longer the ship's cook," he continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "From this moment on, you are my prisoner, a valuable one. You will stay in this cabin, and you will tell me everything you know about Alistair, his habits, his allies, the names of his commanders, the routes his ships take. You ran from your cage, Princess, only to land in mine, but in this cage, you will be of use." She stared at him, horrified and amazed. He wasn't saving her, he was weaponizing her. He was turning her knowledge, her history, her very identity into another cannon in his war against the Duke. She was a captive once more, but this time her enemy was not a cruel suitor. It was a man she had, against all reason, begun to see as a protector. A man whose own secrets were buried far deeper than her own. His war was now hers, whether she wanted it or not.
To the crew of the Serpent's Kiss, she had vanished. One moment she was Leah, the cook who had been revealed as a princess. The next, she was swallowed by the captain's cabin, becoming a ghost, a rumor whispered on the night watch. For Elara, the world had shrunk to a 10-by-10-foot cage of wood and glass. It was a strange sort of prison. The food was better, the cot was softer, but the freedom was gone. She could see the endless ocean through the stern windows, a constant, mocking reminder of a liberty she had tasted and lost. Her jailer was Kane himself. He was no longer a distant, silent figure. He was a constant presence, a storm contained within the small cabin, and his war had become the center of her new existence. Their days fell into a tense new rhythm. They were not captor and prisoner so much as interrogator and intelligence asset. Kane would spend hours with her, spreading charts across the table, his finger tracing shipping lanes and coastlines. His questions were relentless, precise, and impersonal. Which ports does Alistair use for his private trade? What are the patrol schedules for the royal frigates near the Azure Straits? Who is the harbor master in Silver Cove? Is he loyal to the crown or to the Duke's gold? Elara answered him. She dredged up years of conversations overheard at court, of state dinners and whispered political gossip. She had been raised at the epicenter of power, and she knew more than she had ever realized. She gave him the information, piece by piece, watching as he absorbed it, his mind like a map fitting her knowledge into his own dark strategy. But she did not give it for free. For every piece of information she gave, she demanded something in return. "Why do you need to know about the watchtowers on the southern coast? They guard nothing of value," she would challenge. "Why this obsession with Alistair's personal fleet and not the king's navy?" Most of the time he would ignore her, his face a mask of stone, but she was persistent, a steady drip of water on his iron resolve. She was using the only weapon she had left, her mind. She started to notice the cracks in his armor. He never slept for more than a few hours at a time, and when he did, he was plagued by nightmares. One night, a strangled cry from his cot woke her. She saw him in the moonlight, his body rigid, his hands clenched as if strangling an unseen foe. He was whispering a name over and over, a name that was not Alistair. The name was Isla. The sound was filled with such raw agony that Elara felt her breath catch in her throat. He woke with a jolt, sitting bolt upright, and his eyes found hers in the darkness. There was no threat in his gaze, only the raw, unguarded look of a man who had been ripped from a living hell. He said nothing, simply stood up and walked out onto the deck, remaining there until dawn. The next day the unspoken tension between them had changed. The fragile barrier of their tactical arrangement had been breached. During their session over the charts, Elara decided to press her advantage. He was pointing to a small, insignificant island on the map. Alistair keeps a private treasury here. How are its defenses? Elara looked at the island, then back at him. It is a rock, barren. Why would he keep a treasury there? It makes no tactical sense. She looked him in the eye. And who is Isla? Kane froze. The pen in his hand stopped moving. The silence in the cabin was absolute, heavier than any storm. He slowly raised his head, and the cold, controlled mask was gone. In its place was a look of pure, soul-deep pain. He had built walls of iron around his heart for years, and a princess turned cook had just walked through them as if they weren't there. He walked to the stern window, looking out at the wake of the ship. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, torn from a place he kept locked away. Tactics, strategy. You think this is a war for gold or for power. He turned to face her, and his eyes were the eyes of a ghost. This is not a war. It is an exorcism. He took a deep breath, the confession costing him more than any battle ever could. The island is called Oakhaven. It was not always a barren rock. It was my home. Alistair wanted the land, not for its value, but for its strategic position. We refused to sell. My family, my Isla, was my younger sister. He paused, his voice cracking for a fraction of a second before turning back to steel. He didn't just buy the land from a corrupt governor. He made an example of us. He blockaded the island, starved us, and when we fought back, he burned it. He burned the fields, the homes, the docks. He burned everything. I was just a boy, and I watched him burn my world to ash from a fishing boat that I had escaped on. The truth landed in the center of the cabin with the force of a cannonball, shattering everything Elara thought she knew. This wasn't hatred. It was the hollowed-out ruin of a great love. His relentless pursuit of Alistair was not the ambition of a pirate. It was the sacred duty of a survivor. He was not just trying to defeat his enemy, he was trying to erase a ghost. Elara stared at him. Her own anger at Alistair felt like a pale imitation of the inferno that drove this man. She now understood. She was not his prisoner. She was the key. Kane turned back to the chart, his voice once again cold, but with a new, terrifying edge of purpose. You told me the Duke is planning to attend the spring gala in Silver Cove next month, that his new flagship, the Invictus, will be anchored in the bay. He looked at her, his gray eyes now burning with a cold fire. He thinks he is untouchable there, surrounded by the Navy. He drew a stark, red line on the chart, not towards the remote island, but directly to the heavily fortified city of Silver Cove. He is wrong, Kane said, his voice a low promise of violence.
The sea was a sheet of black glass on the night they came for Silver Cove. The Serpent's Kiss flew no colors. Its sails dyed a dark gray to blend with the night, moving like a phantom towards the glittering port city. From the deck, they could hear the faint sound of music drifting from the shore. The Duke's gala was in full swing. The bay was filled with the imposing silhouettes of the Royal Navy, a steel forest protecting the lion in his den. Every man in Kane's crew knew the plan was madness, a single pirate ship against a fleet. But they were not following a man seeking treasure. They were following a man seeking to settle a debt written in blood and fire. And that was a cause they would follow to the gates of hell itself. In the captain's cabin, Elara looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She was no longer wearing a servant's rags. She was wearing a simple but elegant dark blue gown, one they had liberated from a captured merchant ship weeks ago. It was her battle armor.
"This will only work if he believes you are truly beaten," Kane said, his voice a low rumble. He stood not beside her, but with her, a partner in the most dangerous play of their lives. "He is arrogant. His pride is his greatest weakness." Elara nodded, her heart a steady drum. "I know. His world is built on the belief that everyone can be bought or broken. He will not be able to comprehend that I came back willingly to watch him fall." Their eyes met, and in that moment there was no captain and no princess. There were only two survivors, two souls reforged by the same fire, about to aim that fire back at the man who started it. The plan was as insane as it was brilliant. Under the cover of darkness, Elara was rowed ashore in a small dinghy. She didn't sneak into the city. She walked directly to the main guard post, her head held high, and announced her name. The chaos was immediate. Within the hour, she was brought before Duke Alistair in a private chamber of the gala hall. He stood there, resplendent in silks and jewels, a triumphant smirk on his face. "My dear," he said, circling her like a vulture, "did you truly think a kitchen wench's rags would suit you? I am relieved you have come to your senses." "I did not come back for you," Elara said, her voice cold as ice. "I am here to accept my duty to the kingdom." It was the perfect lie, a play on his own political ambitions. His smile widened. He believed he had won. But as he gloated, Elara's eyes were on the bay. She saw a flicker of light from the serpent's kiss, the signal. Her part of the plan was complete. Suddenly, the night erupted, not with the roar of cannons, but with the searing flash of fire arrows, all aimed at one target: the Invictus, Alistair's personal flagship. Kane wasn't fighting the fleet, he was ignoring it. He was cutting the head off the snake. Pandemonium broke out at the gala as nobles scrambled, seeing the pride of the Duke's personal navy burning in the harbor. Alistair's face contorted in rage. "That pirate Felth!" he snarled, grabbing Elara's arm. "You will watch from my balcony as I sink his pathetic little ship." He dragged her out onto the grand balcony overlooking the bay, a stage for all the nobility to see. But the scene was not what he expected. The Serpent's Kiss, using the burning flagship as a smokescreen, had used grappling lines not to attack other ships, but to swing itself around the pier, crashing directly into the seawall below the gala. It was an impossible, suicidal maneuver. As Alistair stared in disbelief, a figure emerged from the smoke and flames below, climbing the trellises of the palace with inhuman speed. It was Kane. He vaulted over the balcony railing, landing silently, his twin cutlasses in his hands, his gray eyes burning with a hatred that was centuries old. The noble screamed. Alistair drew his own ornate rapier, his face a mask of shock and fury. "You, the ghost of Oak Haven." "I am the debt you failed to pay," Kane replied, his voice calm, which was far more terrifying than any shout. They clashed in a blur of steel. Alistair was a skilled fencer, trained in the finest schools, but Kane did not fight like a nobleman. He fought like a storm, like a memory, his every move fueled by a lifetime of loss. He disarmed the Duke with a brutal efficiency, sending his rapier clattering across the marble floor. Kane cornered him against the railing, the point of his cutlass at his throat. "You took everything from me," Kane growled, his face inches from the terrified Duke's face. "Now you will pay for it." But before he could deliver the final blow, Elara's voice cut through the tension. "Wait!" Kane paused, his eyes still locked on his enemy. Elara stepped forward, her gaze not on Kane, but on the horrified nobles watching them. "He will not die by a pirate's blade," she announced, her voice ringing with royal authority. "He will be judged by the kingdom he sought to control." She looked directly at Alistair, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You will not have a quick death. You will have a slow, public ruin. You will be stripped of your titles, your lands, your name. You will die in a forgotten cell, and history will remember you only as a traitor. That is a fate worse than death. That is my revenge." Kane stared at her, then at the pathetic, broken man before him. He saw the truth in her words. Killing Alistair would end his pain. Letting him live, disgraced and destroyed, was the truer vengeance. With a final look of contempt, Kane lowered his blade. He grabbed Elara's hand. "It's time to go." Their escape was as chaotic as their arrival. They plunged from the balcony into the sea below and were pulled back to the Serpent's Kiss by the crew as the Royal Navy finally began to organize. They slipped out of the bay, disappearing into the darkness just as they had arrived. Days later, the open sea was their home once more. The news had reached them on the wind. Duke Alistair had been arrested, his crimes exposed by the testimony of other nobles who had witnessed the confrontation. The kingdom was in turmoil, but that was a world away. On the deck of the Serpent's Kiss, Elara stood at the helm, her hands confidently on the wheel. Kane stood beside her, watching the horizon. His vengeance was complete, but it had not filled the emptiness inside him. It had only cleared the way for something new. "So what now, Princess?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard him speak. "I can take you to a neutral port. You could start a new life. Disappear." Elara looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. She had been running for so long, she was done running. What is the point of being free if you have to be alone? She turned her gaze back to the endless blue horizon. "You told me I was in your cage, but the truth is, I haven't felt this free in my entire life." Kane was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, not as an asset, not as a princess, but as the woman who had seen the ghost in his heart and had not turned away. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the wheel. "The entire world will still be hunting for you," he said. "Then let them hunt," Elara replied, her eyes shining with the light of 1,000 dawns. She was not a princess in a tower. He was not a ghost bound by vengeance. They were a king and queen of their own floating kingdom, their throne the deck of a pirate ship, their crown the salt spray in the wind. They were not a story that had ended. They were a legend that had just begun.